In November 1897, in the small town of Red Lodge, Carbon County, Montana, where most families believed that thick-walled log cabins with steep roofs were the only standard for surviving a mountain winter. Yet those very cabins failed time and again. Wind pierced through the gaps in the logs. Heat escaped quickly. And at night the temperature inside homes often dropped to just 35–40 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing many families to burn tables, chairs, and furnishings to stay warm. In that community lived the widow Marin Avery, 63 years old, alone after her husband died because their cabin could not retain heat during the sudden cold snap of 1894. Instead of rebuilding another log cabin, she began constructing a domed earth shelter, a semi-subterranean structure based entirely on the physical principles of Earth's heat retention. A layer of straw to reduce heat transfer, compacted earth to maintain stable temperature, and living sod to minimize loss. Her project drew mockery from the entire town. People said she was digging her own grave, that this type of house belonged to nomadic times and was unfit for civilized people. Men with 20–30 years of experience building cabins all declared that the earth dome would collapse in the first heavy snow, and, without a large fireplace, it couldn't possibly stay warm. But the data told a different story. When the shelter was only half completed, Marin placed a thermometer inside and recorded a steady 55 degrees Fahrenheit that did not drop with the cold winds. Meanwhile, surrounding cabins fell to 38 degrees Fahrenheit despite constantly burning stoves. The difference stemmed from a simple principle. Deep earth maintains a nearly constant temperature, unaffected by wind drawing heat away like wooden walls. The massive earth surrounding the shelter acted as a gigantic thermal battery, absorbing and releasing heat far more slowly than wood. Still, no one believed her. Most dismissed her measurements as random, lucky, or irrelevant to a real winter. To them, Marin was just an old widow making life harder for herself. But they did not know that the very structure they ridiculed based on simple yet effective physics would become the only place to reach 70 degrees Fahrenheit during the harshest blizzard Red Lodge had ever faced. Immediately after deciding not to rebuild a log cabin, Marin Avery opened the notebook. Her husband, Elias Avery, had left behind after many years as a miner and technician specializing in root cellars. The notebook totaled 47 pages, filled with hand-drawn diagrams, specifications, and thermal principles Elias had distilled over nearly 28 years working beneath Montana's cold ground. The design centered on four main principles. First, a depth of 6–8 feet below the surface marked the boundary of thermal stability. Earth at that depth maintains around 50–55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round and is virtually unaffected by outside air temperature. Second, the domed roof distributes snow load evenly in all directions rather than concentrating it at one point like a flat roof, reducing collapse risk when snow exceeds 2 feet. Third, layers of straw and living sod form a natural insulating blanket with a low thermal conductivity of about 0.250, 35 W/m/K, roughly 40% lower than pine wood. Fourth, an L-shaped ventilation system separates cold and warm airflows, creating a wind reduction effect, so cold air does not rush in whenever the door opens, while allowing smoke and moisture to escape without lowering overall temperature. Marin studied every line carefully, even remeasuring multiple times, then began building the shelter according to those exact principles. However, as soon as she broke ground, the three most influential men in town immediately objected. Village leader Nathaniel Crow, who had built log cabins for 30 years and was regarded as the authority on traditional construction, stood in front of the excavation and declared, "An underground house is the way barbarians live." His argument rested on the belief that any structure below ground would inevitably be damp, dark, and inadequately ventilated for human habitation. Pastor Amos Pike warned that mold would kill her before the cold, citing the average 18–22% moisture in deep soil that could breed fungus and bacteria. Carpenter Jonas Breen, who had erected more than 40 cabins, confidently concluded that the earth dome would collapse as soon as snow exceeded 1 foot, because, in his experience, curved wood lacked the strength to bear weight in freezing conditions. All this opposition convinced the community that Marin was putting herself in danger. But from a technical perspective, Their arguments lacked accuracy. In the first week alone, Marin excavated a total of 12,000 pounds of earth, creating a pit 7 feet deep, 9 feet wide, and 14 feet long enough for 1-2 people to live in for an extended period. She built the roof frame from 18 saplings, 1.52 inches in diameter, bent to a 5-foot radius. When lashed together with twine, the dome formed a self-supporting structure similar to the principle used by ancient Inuit and Icelanders. She then laid a 6-inch layer of straw to keep soil from falling through, applied 12 inches of clay straw plaster for cohesion, covered it with 18 inches of dry earth for primary insulation, and finished with 6 inches of living sod to stabilize the surface, prevent erosion, and enhance heat retention. She dug a 1.5-foot drainage trench around the base to ensure no standing moisture. In testing, she fired a small stone stove equivalent to 1,200-1,500 British thermal units and monitored heat loss. After 3 hours, the interior temperature rose to 62 degrees Fahrenheit and remained stable at 55-57 degrees Fahrenheit even after the fire went out. This proved the thermal mass of the earth walls worked exactly as Elias had described in his notebook. The soil absorbed heat from the stove, stored it, and released it over 8-12 hours, maintaining even warmth without constant burning. Compared to log cabins, where heat escaped through gaps and exposed surfaces, the earth shelter reduced energy loss by 40-60%, cutting firewood consumption nearly in half. But the community cared nothing for physics. They only saw an old widow kneeling in the cold dirt, hunched over, binding straw and plastering mud like someone living on the fringes of society. Groups of townspeople gathered, arms folded, watching her work and laughing. An old woman alone thinks she's building a fortress? That pile of dirt will collapse before Christmas. Children passing by called it the dirt mound hut and dared each other to touch the dome to see if it wobbled. Jonas Breen often stood nearby, shaking his head. When the snow gets heavy, you'll come crawling to my house for shelter. But Marin never responded to any of the taunts. Each morning she recorded in her log: outside temperature, temperature inside the shelter, stove burning time, and firewood used. For 17 straight days, her data showed the interior stable at 55-57 degrees Fahrenheit, while surrounding cabins managed only 38-42 degrees Fahrenheit. No one believed the numbers were real. They said she measured wrong, had a cheap thermometer, or that the readings didn't reflect real blizzard conditions. But she understood one thing: physical principles do not change because of human mockery. By late December, the shelter was complete. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a low mound with a small wooden door. To the community, it was a failure. From a technical viewpoint, it was the only structure in the valley capable of surviving an extreme winter. And then the real winter arrived to prove who was right. In November 1897, the first cold winds from Canada began sweeping down into Red Lodge. Not the familiar early winter chill, but a dry, sharp, compressed cold that immediately put the town's older residents on alert. An elderly man who had survived the 1,876 blizzard said the smell of this wind was identical to the day before the valley lost nearly half its livestock, and 3 families froze to death. The warning spread quickly, but it was dismissed just as fast, because everyone trusted that traditional log cabins were sufficient. Yet within the first week of November, frost began forming on the inside of cabin walls throughout Red Lodge. At night, even with blazing stoves, temperatures in many homes dropped from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few hours. Some families reported that touching the cabin walls in the morning felt like touching cold stone. Many blamed it on unusual weather this year, but no one questioned the outdated building method. Meanwhile, Marin quietly checked her earth shelter every day. She conducted a simple test, lighting only a single candle for 30 minutes and then measuring again. Result: interior temperature remained steady at 55-57 degrees Fahrenheit, with no more than a 2 degrees Fahrenheit difference between morning and evening. The surrounding earth mass performed exactly as Elias had described, absorbing even tiny amounts of heat and holding it like a natural thermal storage. Rumors about the strange shelter that stays warmer than cabins began circulating, prompting a few curious people to ask to see it. but they entered with obvious sarcasm, as if wanting to prove it was only warm by coincidence. They touched the earth walls, found them not as cold as expected, yet still said, "Earth is always damp. Wait until heavy snow and see how long it holds." No one wanted to admit anything, because doing so would mean admitting they were wrong. Village leader Nathaniel Crow, who had rejected the design from the start, was actually the one who began worrying most. He inventoried the town's firewood reserves and realized this year's cold had arrived nearly 3 weeks earlier than usual. If winter dragged on, firewood could run out before February. But when he raised the issue at a town meeting, most people just laughed. Wood has always kept us warm, just like it did our grandfathers. No one wanted to believe that the log cabin, the symbol of mountain survival, was revealing serious weaknesses. And even fewer wanted to believe that a 63-year-old widow with her half-buried shelter possessed the only structure in town capable of withstanding the abnormal winter approaching. But blizzards do not care who is right or wrong. They simply arrive when they are meant to. Log cabins had long been considered the standard in Red Lodge, but viewed through a scientific rather than habitual lens, they revealed numerous limitations that Marin's earth shelter naturally overcame. First, log cabins lose heat very quickly. Wood has a thermal conductivity 40–60% higher than compacted earth, and it expands and contracts with moisture, causing gaps to appear constantly. When winter winds blow at 20–30 miles per hour, those small gaps become heat suction pipes, pulling warm air out and pushing cold air in. Thus, cabins required 4–5 cords of wood per month to maintain only about 40–45 degrees Fahrenheit, and consumption rose even higher in stronger winds. In contrast, Marin's earth shelter faced no direct wind impact. Buried 6–8 feet underground, the structure was almost completely isolated from air temperature fluctuations. Deep earth acted as a stabilizing blanket, holding 50–55 degrees Fahrenheit even when outside air plunged dozens of degrees below zero. This prevented the sudden heat draw experienced by log cabins. Humidity and daily temperature swings in the shelter were also lower. Log cabins typically saw winter humidity fluctuate between 25–35%, leading to condensation on surfaces and faster heat loss. The earth shelter, thanks to compacted earth and living sod, maintained more stable humidity around 15–20%, significantly reducing heat loss through evaporation. Daily temperature variation in cabins could reach 15–20 degrees Fahrenheit, while the earth shelter rarely exceeded 2–3 degrees Fahrenheit. This stability kept the space warmer without constant energy input. In terms of heating efficiency, cabins wasted energy due to their 3-direction heat escape. Walls transmitted heat quickly, steep roofs faced direct cold winds, and the ground beneath was always colder than the air. Marin's shelter, however, utilized the thermal mass Elias had documented. When a small stove was fired, the 24–36-inch thick earth walls absorbed all the heat and released it slowly over 8–12 hours, maintaining steady warmth with far less firewood. Marin used only about 1/3 the wood of a cabin, roughly 1.5 cords per month. The dome shape was another key scientific factor. Cabins had dead corners where cold air pooled, while the dome had no corners, allowing warm air to circulate evenly along the curved surface. This reduced stratification where cabin ceilings were hot but lower areas remained bitterly cold. The 6-inch straw layer and 6-inch living sod atop the roof served to slow heat transfer. Straw contains countless tiny air pockets for low conductivity, while sod, with its water and living roots, further stabilized temperature far better than dry wood. Combined, these layers dramatically slowed heat loss compared to cabins. Everything Elias had recorded years earlier proved correct. Earth does not fight the weather like wood. Earth ignores the weather. Log cabins tried to defeat the cold by burning energy constantly, while the earth shelter only needed to warm the soil mass once and let it hold the heat itself. Though the people of Red Lodge still trusted their traditional cabins, the technical numbers told a different story. In a brutal winter, it was not the noble material of wood that prevailed, but the material they had scorned earth. And that quiet advantage prepared Marin's shelter for the true life-or-death test when the great blizzard was about to strike. By the second week of December 1897, Red Lodge began feeling the full abnormality of the winter. Many cabins dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit despite all three stoves burning continuously from afternoon until midnight. Some families reported that even adding more wood, thermometers refused to climb above 42 degrees Fahrenheit. And just 30 minutes after stopping the fire, cabins fell below 38 degrees Fahrenheit. This rate of heat loss far exceeded previous years, causing the town's oldest residents to grow anxious, while younger ones merely insisted, "It's just a bit colder this year." But on December 14, a serious sign appeared. The Ketter family reported their 8-year-old son Eli suffering numb fingertips while sleeping near a cabin window. When Pastor Pike visited, he discovered mild frostbite on 2 fingertips, a level of injury that only occurs from prolonged exposure to excessively low temperatures. The news spread throughout town. But instead of acknowledging that log cabins were failing, most residents blamed bad luck or the family not burning enough wood. Yet many households' firewood stacks were depleting rapidly. Based on current consumption, several families calculated that reserves meant to last until March might now run out by mid-January. Leader Crow discovered the communal woodpile had dropped 20% in just 10 days, an unprecedented figure. But when he raised the alarm, most simply replied, "When it's cold, you burn more. That's all." As residents tried to push away their unease, Marin Avery quietly recorded every figure: outside temperature, wind speed, temperatures in neighboring cabins, and temperatures in her own shelter. For 19 consecutive days, her shelter's interior remained steady at 55-57 degrees Fahrenheit, even as nighttime lows outside reached 10-15 degrees Fahrenheit. She noticed the pattern of temperature variation matched exactly the notes Elias had made before the 1894 blizzard struck. Changes in air pressure, the way cold winds arrived in waves, and rapidly dropping humidity signaled the formation of an extremely powerful cold front from the north. She analyzed the data, compared it to Elias's notebook, and concluded that a large-scale storm, not an ordinary blizzard, was forming. She warned Crow that if winds eased just a few points and humidity fell below 20%, a deep freeze similar to the killing winter the town elders often mentioned would occur. Crow listened, sighed, and replied, "Mrs. Avery, winter winds are always cold. Log cabins have withstood them since our grandfather's time." When Marin tried to explain thermal mass and the abnormal heat loss in cabins, Crow interrupted, "Earth can't beat wood. I've been building cabins for 30 years. No one believed the technical signs she recorded truly foretold disaster. To them, she was just an old widow obsessed with the past. But Marin knew. Numbers do not lie. And when they shifted exactly according to the pattern of catastrophe, the storm was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. What was approaching Red Lodge was not merely a cold winter. It was the first real test for every structure in town, and a test only she had prepared for long ago. On the night of the 21st of December, 1897, the blizzard Marin had predicted for weeks began sweeping down on Red Lodge with a speed no one was ready for. Outdoor thermometers plunged from 5 degrees Fahrenheit to 22 degrees Fahrenheit in just 3 hours, then continued dropping unchecked. By midnight, north winds reached 70 miles per hour, strong enough to shake the very ground, while the air was knife-sharp like metal, carrying tiny but densely packed snow grains that struck cabin walls like gravel. Less than an hour later, the first cabin roof collapsed the Carter families on the edge of town. Snow weight crushed the already shrunken rafters on the steep roof. When the roof gave way, cold wind blasted straight into the bedroom, forming ice instantly on blanket edges. The father tried adding wood, but wind reversed down the chimney, reducing the fire to weak embers. In another cabin, the Dawson family burned their dining table and 2 wooden chairs to keep their young daughter warm. Yet even with roaring flames, the indoor thermometer reached only 25 degrees Fahrenheit before falling to 20 degrees Fahrenheit as winds strengthened. 4-year-old Annie Dawson turned purple at the lips and fingertips, sending her mother into panicked sobs while her father split the family's last remaining cabinet for firewood. Nearby, 78-year-old Ruth Whitaker sat huddled beside her stove yet still shivered uncontrollably. She was exhausted from the cold. Her son wrapped 3 blankets around her but saw no improvement. At the Ketter home, young Eli, the boy previously frostbitten, began losing feeling in his fingertips again, this time more severely. The town doctor could not reach homes because winds were too fierce, snow neared 3 feet deep, and visibility was only a few feet in the whiteout. Log cabins, long the symbol of Red Lodge's resilience, had become mere hollow wooden boxes pierced by wind. Temperatures inside most cabins hovered at 18-22 degrees Fahrenheit, some dropping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Some families dragged beds right next to stoves to warm directly by flame heat, but doing so only forced them to breathe more smoke when wind forced it back into rooms. At an emergency midnight meeting in village leader Crow's home, the fire was fed with table legs, door fragments, even picture frames. Crow, who had insisted cabins were warm enough since our grandfather's day, now stared silently at shivering townspeople before him. Wind screamed through every plank gap, producing a prolonged howl like twisting metal. Crow placed a thermometer near the door and watched it fall to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, right in the main room. Even after closing the door, wind still poured through joints as if the cabin did not exist. The blizzard had shattered generations of faith in Red Lodge. No one still believed log cabins would last until morning. While the entire town sank into chaos, Marin Avery stood in her yard facing the 42 degrees Fahrenheit wind head-on. She checked the thermometer hanging under the eaves. The needle had fallen to the lowest mark she had ever seen. She bent down, opened the shelter door, stepped onto the wooden stairs, and closed it against the gusts. When she lit her oil lamp and looked at the thermometer on the earthen table, the reading made her pause for several seconds. 66 degrees Fahrenheit. She slightly opened the ventilation flap, added a small handful of wood to the stove, and just 20 minutes later, the thermometer climbed to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind, no shaking, no cold seepage. Only the absolute stability of Earth, the very thing she had trusted from the beginning. In stark contrast to the desperate log cabins, Marin's shelter proved every thermal principle Elias had left behind. Earth does not fight the cold. Earth absorbs and neutralizes it. She stood inside, hands resting on the still warm earth walls, and understood this was no longer a peculiar structure. It was proof. Outside, the town was shifting from skepticism to realizing the true disaster. Log cabins, the pride of generations, were losing completely, and the only path to survival would soon lead to the one place still holding warmth: Marin Avery's shelter, nearly 3 a.m. When the blizzard reached its deepest cold at 42 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 miles per hour, winds blew so fiercely they shook the very ground. Village leader Nathaniel Crow made a decision he never thought he would, carrying his 6-year-old son, who was suffering from hypothermia, and leading his family out into the whiteout to reach Marin Avery's earth shelter. The boy was barely responsive, his lips purple, breathing slow and shallow, while the Crow cabin, even after burning through all remaining firewood, hovered at just 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind screaming through the planks made Crow realize that if he waited another hour, his son might not survive. He wrapped 2 blankets around the child, shielded his face from the wind with his own coat, then pulled his wife along as they ran through the storm. When they reached the door of Marin's shelter, he pounded with knuckles already numb from cold and nearly collapsed when the door opened. The reddish glow from the oil lamps inside spilled onto them, and warm air wafted out like soft smoke, in complete contrast to the deadly cold outside. Marin needed only a glance at the boy to know how serious it was. She ushered them in, closed the door, and said almost decisively, "Lay the boy against the earth wall. It holds heat best there." As Crow carried his son closer to the wall, he instinctively placed his hand on the compacted earth surface and startled. The wall was warm, not just not cold, but actually warm. Before he could put it into words, another group appeared at the shelter door. This time it was the Dawson family, those who had laughed the loudest when Marin built her dome. The father carried 4-year-old Annie, purple all over. They brought nothing but a thin blanket. Right behind them came the Whitaker family, then the Ketters. Some shivering, some panicked, some so terrified they no longer felt shame. They only knew their cabins could no longer protect them. Some nearly shouted, begging the door to open when they saw the warm light inside. "Please, my child is so cold already. We have no more firewood. Mrs. Avery, save us." Those were the voices that just a day earlier had mocked and scorned her as someone on the fringes of society. Marin opened the door wider, waves of warm air rising like steam from a gently boiling pot. The outside cold wind was instantly blocked by the earth walls and inner straw layer. When the first group stepped in, they paused, held their breath, then nearly broke down in tears upon seeing the number on the thermometer hanging by the earthen table, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. No one could speak. Some placed hands on the walls, many just stood staring at each other, stunned and ashamed. The shelter was not merely warmer than cabins. It felt like a house in autumn, utterly opposite the frozen hell raging above ground. Jonas Breen, the carpenter who had accused Marin of knowing nothing about building, was the last to enter. He stood near the door, body covered in ice, his beard stiffened white like needles. When the shelter's warmth touched his face, the ice on his beard melted into tiny drops falling onto his coat. He looked around at the earth walls, the dome. The thermometer then said softly in a hoarse voice, "Good heavens, you were right." Words he had never spoken to anyone in 30 years of building cabins. From that moment, no one inside the shelter dared mention the word crazy again. No one still thought Marin was different. Contempt vanished the instant their hands touched the warm earth walls. Skepticism melted like the ice on Jonas's beard, and the arrogance of the entire town of Red Lodge collapsed in seconds, replaced by one obvious truth. In the worst blizzard they had ever faced, the only place warm enough to save them was the structure they had mocked the most. This was the first moment of emotional reversal from ridicule to gratitude, from doubt to acknowledgement, and the moment Marin understood life had given her the chance to prove what science and reality always knew. Earth, when used correctly, is stronger than any human prejudice. Within less than an hour after the blizzard hit bottom, Marin Avery's earth shelter held more than 20 people crowded inside. The only light came from 2 oil lamps on the earthen table, casting a small but steady glow enough for everyone to see one another and feel the stark contrast between the white death outside and the safe warmth in the heart of the earth. The air was initially filled with crying, gasping breaths, and small children whimpering from cold. But once the wooden door closed and wind was completely shut out, groups began feeling the heat spread evenly through the space. The thermometer still read 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a level no cabin in town achieved even with 3 stoves blazing at once. Marin immediately shifted into caregiving mode. She heated a small pot of water on the stone stove, needing less than a small bundle of wood thanks to the wall's heat retention. She divided the warm water into small cups, giving it first to those showing signs of hypothermia. She spread old but thick blankets around the shelter corners to create temporary sleeping spots. Watching her work quickly and organized, many realized she had prepared for this scenario long ago. Little Annie Dawson was placed against the earth wall where thermal mass was strongest. After about an hour, her lips lost their purple tint, breathing steadied. Her mother burst into tears seeing her daughter recover bit by bit, while their cabin had been so cold, blankets hardened with ice. Nearby, the crow boy gradually warmed too. He was wrapped in a thick wool blanket Marin provided, the kind that retained heat well even in low humidity. When his body temperature rose to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the crows squeezed each other's hands, eyes shifting from despair to gratitude. In one corner, elderly Mrs. Whitaker, the frailest, was placed near the stone stove. The gradually warming earth wall helped restore her breathing. She no longer shook uncontrollably as in her cabin. By the second day, the shelter was no longer just refuge from the storm. It became a place of rebirth for life. An unexpected event occurred when Mrs. Miller, a woman who had arrived with her husband and 2 small children, went into labor. Under normal circumstances, they would take her to the midwife over 5 miles away, but now all roads were blocked by nearly 4 feet of snow. With no other choice, everyone pushed the wooden table aside, spread blankets on the ground, and Marin organized a temporary birthing area. She washed her hands with hot water, instructed the husband to hold his wife's hand tightly, and told everyone to stay quiet. 30 minutes later, the first cry rang out, a healthy, rosy baby boy with warm breath. In a night cold enough to crack steel, a child was still born inside the very shelter the town had once called a stupid dirt mound. Emotion spread through the shelter. One man whispered, "If she hadn't built this place, none of us would live to see dawn." 3 days passed almost in a loop. The storm howling above ground, but inside the shelter temperature fluctuated only 68–72 degrees Fahrenheit. People shared warm water, hard bread, and Marin's remaining small firewood supply. When the stone stove went out, temperature dropped just 2 degrees Fahrenheit, over 6 hours, proving to those who had mocked her an unbelievably high thermal efficiency. By the third day, as the storm continued but lessened in intensity, a clear shift occurred in the townspeople's attitude. Those who had opposed most strongly began apologizing publicly. Jonas Breen, the carpenter who insisted the dome would collapse under 1 foot of snow, placed his hand on the wall and said quietly, "I was wrong, completely wrong." Pastor Pike, who had warned dampness would kill her before the cold, sat near the stove and admitted the shelter ventilated better than his cabin. Even village leader Crow, the lifelong defender of log cabin tradition, bowed his head and thanked her in a choked voice. Seeing the change, Marin did not reproach, but simply said, "I didn't build this shelter to beat anyone. I built it because physics is always right, even when people don't believe it." Those words opened something unexpected. The group began asking her about heat retention principles, why deep earth stays stable, why wind cannot penetrate the shelter. They listened no longer with contempt, but with genuine curiosity and gratitude. In 3 days, the shelter became both lifesaver and teacher for the entire town, a lesson they had refused for years. Science and understanding do not care about prejudice. They only wait for the moment to prove themselves right. As the wind outside began weakening, everyone knew they would emerge from the shelter utterly changed from when they entered, not just warmer in body, but awakened from their mistaken beliefs. As the wind weakened and the leaden sky revealed the first patches of light after 3 days of darkness, the shelter door was pushed open. Warm air from deep earth escaped like faint smoke, in complete contrast to the lingering bitter cold on the surface. People stepped out slowly, cautiously, as if leaving another world. The town of Frosthaven before them was no longer the place they had left 3 days earlier. 6 cabins had collapsed roofs. Entire rafters snapped like matchsticks under nearly 4 feet of packed snow. Those still standing had cracked walls, broken doors, interiors coated in ice. 3 livestock barns lay silent, where cattle and horses once sounded now only frozen bodies of animals all dead from the 42 degrees Fahrenheit night. Many families lost everything. Furniture burned, beds reduced to frames, half-charred clothes scattered on floors. People stood silent, facing consequences they had never imagined. Had they stayed in their cabins one more night, Frosthaven might no longer be a community but a snow-covered graveyard. Leader Crow gripped his wife's hand, eyes scanning the devastation, then whispered loud enough for all to hear, "Without that shelter we would have lost at least half the valley." No one disagreed. Every person, every family knew his words were truth. The children, those who had trembled in terror inside freezing cabins, now looked at Marin differently, no longer the eccentric widow building a dirt house, but the person who saved their families. Emily Dawson, the girl who nearly lost fingers to cold, ran to hug her. The small face looked up, eyes still red but full of gratitude. Mrs. Marin saved all of Frosthaven. Those words silenced the surrounding adults for seconds. Jonas Breen removed his hat, bowed his head. Pastor Pike placed a hand on his chest, sighed deeply. Even those who had mocked her most could no longer avoid her gaze. No one still saw her shelter as folly or madness. The truth had become too clear, truth written in numbers, in physics, and in human lives. They understood Marin had not just built a shelter. She had built the chance to survive that no one else foresaw. And in that moment, amid the ruins of Frosthaven, they collectively realized one thing. The woman ridiculed for months was the reason the entire valley still stood here seeing sunlight. When news spread beyond Frosthaven that Marin Avery's shelter maintained 70 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the 42 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard, Carbon County authorities immediately sent a team of engineers to inspect it. They arrived with equipment to measure R value, humidity sensors, and tools to assess heat loss. Results astonished them. The 12-inch compacted earth layer, plus 18 inches of dry soil and 6 inches of living sod, produced an R value equal to or higher than many log walls used in local cabins. The inner straw lining reduced heat transfer to unusually low levels, while the dome distributed all snow pressure without structural weak points. Engineers recorded heat loss from the shelter at roughly 1/4 that of standard log cabins. In cabins, heat escaped through walls, roof, and wind gaps. In the shelter, loss was nearly zero with the door closed. They drafted a preliminary report stating, "This structure maintains 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit entirely naturally without heating, and can reach 65–70 degrees Fahrenheit with only a small heat source. This is thermal performance far superior to wooden structures used in Montana territory. The report quickly reached Helena, then neighboring towns like Bridger, Joliet, and Bear Creek. Word spread that a 63-year-old widow, mocked by her entire community, had built a structure based on physical principles many experienced cabin builders never grasped. Soon wagons from nearby towns brought builders, carpenters, and the curious to Frosthaven to see the strange shelter. They touched the earth walls, examined the L-shaped ventilation, measured interior humidity, and recorded every detail. Some groups even dug test pits to view the subsurface structure. A formal engineering report by the county's chief engineer confirmed Mrs. Marin Avery's design is among the most effective forms of folk engineering ever recorded for Montana's mountain climate conditions. The structure maximizes Earth's thermal stability principle, minimizes fuel consumption, and maintains survivability in extreme weather. The report was read at a full town meeting in Frosthaven, and the entire hall fell silent as Leader Crow announced the conclusion. He said, slowly and clearly, "We once mocked a person who understood physics more than all of us combined." What followed was unprecedented spread. The Dawson family, the first to run to the shelter, decided to build a small version behind their home. Jonas Breen, the carpenter who opposed most fiercely, became the first in town to personally build a shelter, following Marin's model. This time, under her guidance. Within 2 months, Frosthaven had 11 new earth shelters. Pastor Pike even proposed turning land beside the church into a site for a community shelter for the whole town to use in winter. In other towns, local engineers began experimenting with improvements, adding stone bases for greater thermal mass, installing second vents to reduce loss when opening doors, or using mineral-rich clay mixes for durability. A year-end 1,898 report by the Montana Territorial Survey recorded over 40 new shelters built on the Frosthaven design. Most surprising was interest from the scientific community. A group of faculty from the University of Montana wrote requesting direct survey for research into passive thermal engineering. In their letter they wrote, Mrs. Avery's work proves that folk engineering, when grounded in correct physical principles, can achieve performance superior to prevalent wooden structures. For Frosthaven, the spread was not just pride, it was a fundamental shift in building mindset. Those who once saw wood as the symbol of civilization now understood the answer, sometimes lay right beneath their feet in the very earth they had viewed as primitive. Children in the valley no longer called Marin's shelter Dirt Mound Hut. Now the whole town called it by another name, Avery Heat Vault, the heat vault of Mrs. Avery. And every time winter returned, Frosthaven residents lit a lamp outside that first shelter, as a reminder that their lives had once been saved by knowledge they had scorned for decades. Many years after the historic blizzard, Marin Avery's original earth shelter still stood intact on the edge of Frosthaven, a silent testament to the correctness of knowledge the community once ridiculed. The people decided to erect a wooden sign in front of the door, carved with a simple line containing everything they had experienced. She trusted the earth and saved our valley. That sign became the first stop for every visitor, and the place where generations of town children gathered to hear the story retold of the winter that nearly erased Frosthaven from Montana's map. They grew up with the image of the small, steadfast widow quietly recording temperatures each day despite laughter behind her back. They learned to respect difference through her life story, a lesson needing no textbook or classroom, only memory of the storm night, when the entire valley survived only because of the shelter once called a stupid dirt mound. Gradually, Marin's shelter became more than engineering. It became a symbol of thinking beyond prejudice. Generations of young engineers visited Frosthaven to see the Avery Heat Vault firsthand, and many admitted the design inspired new approaches in cold climate construction. The Crow family, Dawson family, and dozens of others still retold the story each year as winter arrived. They recalled the desperation as cabins lost heat, the roaring wind outside, and the moment they opened the shelter door where warmth rose like life reignited. The apologies offered to Marin that year became tradition. Each winter, adults led children to light a lamp before the shelter in memory of the woman who kept Frosthaven whole. In her final years, Marin never claimed to be an inventor or hero. She only said, "I did what the earth told me to do, But the community understood her legacy went beyond one winter or one design. It was a reminder that knowledge, whether from books, ancestors, or everyday observation, has value when it saves human lives. And more importantly, it taught them a truth the whole of Frosthaven now knew by heart. It is not difference that is wrong. Sometimes the very thing considered foolish is what keeps people alive. If you enjoy stories of survival and forgotten wisdom, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching. See you again in the next surprising journeys.